Okay, in this lecture, let's talk about meandering. Now, meandering is a way that the surveyors in the public land system would segregate water from the land. And it's like a traverse that you would traverse along the bank of a river or the banks around a lake or something like that. And what the purpose of it is to segregate that area from the land so they know exactly how much land they have. And we'll talk more about that. Now, what the surveyors did is they meandered all navigable bodies of water and other important rivers and lakes so they can segregate them from the public lands by the mean high water elevation. What I mean by that is that what they were supposed to do is they were supposed to go along the mean high water elevation and run these lines to locate where the rivers are and the lakes are so they could segregate that out from the uplands or the land itself so they would know how much area was in the land and how much area was in the water. In the original surveys, meander lines are run for the purpose of ascertaining the quantity of lands remaining after the segregation of the water. This is what we've been talking about. So it was a very important thing to do, but the surveys weren't really all that good. And we'll talk about that as we go on. When they were running these meander lines, they would place monuments, or what they called meander corners, were placed where meander lines intersected section lines and township or range lines. Now, if they were meandering inside of a section, they would record the angle points, but they wouldn't monument them at all. So the only monuments that you would have for these meander lines would be on the section lines or the township and range lines. But inside the section, they'd never monumented, or as a rule, they didn't monument any of the angle points, but they did record them in their field notes. Now, before we go on, I just want to go through a couple definitions to make sure that we know what we're talking about. First of all, let's talk about what they mean by low water. The low water mark is a point to which a river or other body of water recedes under ordinary conditions at its lowest stage. Now, the key word here is ordinary conditions. They're not talking about during a drought or something like that. It's just where it would recede to its lowest stage under normal conditions. High water, the high water mark is the line which the water impresses on the soil by covering it for a sufficient period to deprive it of vegetation. Now, you got to be real careful here. It talks about depriving it of vegetation, but there's aquatic vegetation that could grow inside of the high water mark. So you have to be able to segregate the upland vegetation from the aquatic vegetation. So you can imagine that that could leave a lot of people guessing as to where this high water mark was. Now, shorelands. The shorelands is the space between the margin of the high water and the low water. And this was developed in a court case, Alabama versus Georgia in 1859. And so what they determined was you have this low water mark, you have this high water mark, and the shorelands are the area between the two. Now, one thing you have to know about meander lines is that they were never intended to be boundary lines. Their sole purpose was just to try to segregate the amount of land from the amount of water. Now, there are certain cases where meander lines can become boundary lines in the public land survey system, but we're not going to cover that in this lecture. That's a whole different study all of its own. And also, in the state of Washington, under certain conditions, meander lines can be boundary lines, but the state of Washington is the only state that I know of where this exception exists. So the intent of a meander line is not to be a boundary line, but there are some rare, and I mean very rare, cases in the public land system where they morph into boundary lines. And in the state of Washington, under certain conditions, they are considered boundary lines as well. Now, rivers. First, we'll talk about navigable rivers and bayous, as well as rivers not navigable, whose right angle width is 3 chains or more, are meandered on both banks. And they were supposed to be meandered at ordinary mean high water mark by taking the general courses and distances, the manual says, of their sinuosities. And what that means is that just as how the river turns, you're supposed to map all the bends and turns of it and stuff like that at the mean high water. Now, there was a lot of exceptions to this, but this is the way it was supposed to have been done, both banks at mean high water. Navigable rivers or non-navigable rivers that were 3 chains wide or greater. Now, rivers not classified as navigable are not meandered above the point where the average right angle width is less than 3 chains, except when duly authorized. Now, if they had special instructions to meander further up, then they would do that. But if they didn't have those special instructions, they would follow the river up until it became smaller than 3 chains in width, and then they just stop. They just stop meandering it. And the trick here is it had to be a non-navigable river. Now there's a legal, there's legal definitions of navigability and non-navigability, and those things change quite a bit, so there can be some confusion there. Now, all navigable lakes are meandered. Non-navigable lakes are not meandered except for lakes of 50 acres or greater when duly authorized. Now you can see that in section 3-185 of the 2009 manual. That's where you can find out about that. Now, lakes, in a case where a lake, which is located entirely within a section, a quarter section line, if one crosses the lake, a theoretical course is run from one quarter corner to the opposite quarter corner, and then to the margin of the lake. And the distance is measured at the point determined. What I'm trying to say is, at the point where this quarter corner line is hits the lake, they would place a corner there called a special meander corner. And they would establish that, and then they would meander around the lake, and they would come back to this special meander corner. Now, I know that this can be a little bit confusing, but we do have pictures later on, and we'll take a look at all of these things. Now, if a meanderable lake falls entirely within a quarter section, an auxiliary meander corner is established at some suitable point on its margin, that is the bank. And a connection line is run from the established monument to a regular corner on the section boundary. Now, here's what I'm talking about that's different than what we were just talking about. This particular lake is entirely within a quarter section. That means that there's no quarter lines. If you were to establish a quarter line, it wouldn't hit the lake. So what they would do is they would find the nearest controlling monument, that is a quarter corner or section corner, and they would make a tie from that to the lake, and then they'd meander around the perimeter of the lake, and they would have it tied at one place to a controlling monument. Now, islands, every island above mean high water elevation of a meanderable body of water except islands formed in navigable bodies of water after the date of admission into the state, is located by triangulation or direct measurement. So what they would do is they would either triangulate to a point on the island, or they just take a direct measurement to it if they could, and then they'd meander around the island at mean high water. Now, a lot of these islands were meandered in the 1800s. Islands move in rivers, and so the meander line could be far different from where the island is today. Islands are a little tricky. Even though the United States has parted with title to the adjoining mainlands, an island in a meanderable body of water, navigable or non-navigable, in continuous existence since the date of admission of the state into the Union, and omitted from the original surveys, remains a public land of the United States. So you can have patented lands on the mainland, you can have state lands on the mainland, but the island inside of a river can still be part of the public land survey system owned by the United States. So if you're ever in a situation where you have to decide that, you might want to check that, because that could be a big deal. Now let's take a look at what we were talking about. As you can see in this particular graphic, there's this Gamelin Lake, and it has been meandered around the lake, and you'll notice that there's an island in the lake, and they have ties to that island, and you'll see that in there it says WCAMC, and what that stands for is a witness corner to a auxiliary meander corner. And then you can see that we have other meander corners along the sinuosities of the lake, that is along the meander line, where they have auxiliary meander corners. And they also have special meander corners, because down here where it shows a special meander corner, that's because that section line, or that quarter section line connecting one quarter section to another quarter section, crosses the meander line, and that's where they would put a special meander corner. So you can see, if you study this map, you can see where there are auxiliary meander corners and also special meander corners. And that's basically what we were talking about. Now, we've been discussing meander lines. Now, meander lines were intended to segregate the water from the land. All meanderable bodies of water were supposed to be meandered, lakes or rivers. Also, non-navigable rivers, 3 chains wide or more, were supposed to be meandered. Now, as far as rivers are concerned, both banks were supposed to be meandered. And as far as lakes are concerned, if it's a navigable lake, you would meander around the perimeter of the lake at the mean high water. Also, non-navigable lakes, 50 acres or more, were to be meandered. Now, remember, never intended to be boundary lines. In some rare cases, they can become boundary lines. But as a rule, that was not their intent at all. So we need to remember what the purpose of a meander line was, and how we can go about finding out about it and understanding it when we are dealing with the public land survey system.